the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, episode 95.
Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to another edition of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray. So good to have you on today's episode. And today we bring on Diarmaid Williams, who is the International Digital Editor at Power Engineering International and editor at Decentralized Energy. We will link to all of that in the show notes. Those are Penwell publications. And so he comes to us today all the way across the pond from Great Britain. And so we're very thankful for his time to talk about what's going on with energy in Europe. And so enjoy the discussion. And he was insightful. As always, we will link to his stuff again in the show notes, which you can find at globalenergymedia.com. Without further ado, here is Diarmaid Williams. Well, it is always great to talk to someone on the other side of the pond, as we say here in the States. How is it going today?
Not too bad, Ryan. How are you?
Doing well. So let's just kind of jump into it here and keep the discussion very high level for today, because there's so many ways that you can take these topics, and we'll try to stay out the weeds and keep it a high level. European energy power generation. There's a lot of discussion here that we see headlines in the U.S. We see that fossil fuels are going away, nuclear power is going away, cars, electric cars. There's so much going on, at least it appears on that side, on Europe's side, with policy and what's coming down the road. Right now, as someone who's over there, who's in the energy reporting business, what would you say is the biggest story in energy in Europe?
Well, I suppose, the main economic powerhouse here is Germany, and they are also, they've taken it upon themselves to be the leader when it comes to renewable energy. Some would say they've been a little bit rash in terms of, I suppose Germany would be known more for its pragmatic approach in economics and industry, but in terms of energy, they reckon it was an emotional decision to decide to phase out their nuclear power sector after Fukushima incident in Japan 6 years ago. So since then, they have what they call the Energiewende. It's an energy transition policy, which aims to increase the proportion of renewable energy in their power sector. But it's, I suppose, out of all the countries, it's got the most, what I would like to call schizophrenic policy, as even though they promote a lot about what they do in terms of renewables, in that they would have a huge proportion of renewables in their power mix, they also have an equally high extent of coal power and lignite coal power. So, their PR department is very good at talking about how much renewables they've got, but they don't talk as much about the amount of coal that's backboning that economy. They still haven't figured out how to phase out, I suppose, nuclear without relying so much on that coal. It's a surprising thing, because 40% of Germany's energy mix is coal and lignite, and they're one of the highest polluters in Europe. But at the same time, they're also one of the biggest promoters of green energy. Their neighbours Poland get a bad reputation because they are still very much wedded to their coal power industry. Yet even they have come out and said that they're not going to. That they've got 2 more coal power plants to build, 2 to 3 more, and after that, their energy minister has said that they won't be developing any more coal power. Whereas Germany has yet to make that decision. They have a large, I suppose, industrial power base, and a lot of power sector employees who rely on coal for their living. And there's a general election coming up in 2 weeks' time, or in a week's time now, and that part of their electorate needs to be looked after. And the government at the moment, the parties, nobody's saying, apart from the Green Party, that they want to explicitly phase out coal entirely, because they need to keep that part of their electorate sweet. At the same time, different countries around Europe, so you've got France and the UK, have both made public pronouncements in recent months the UK, first of all, saying that they're phasing out coal-fired power entirely. So even though Germany leads the way in terms of renewable investment, other countries have trumped them in terms of maybe doing better in terms of their carbon emission reduction. France itself, pardon the pun, hasn't taken the nuclear option and limited its nuclear power capacity. They have a really healthy, I suppose, power mix in that they have a lot of renewables, but it's backboned by nuclear, which is, of course, largely carbon-free. Meanwhile, in the UK, they're putting more and more investment into gas-fired power, shale gas. And again, that's while it is a fossil fuel, it's still a long way cleaner than the coal power that Germany is using. Meanwhile, Spain, the head of the country's largest utility, told a gathering of power sector professionals in London today at the Bloomberg Energy Summit in London that Spain would no longer be anything other than a renewable power investor. So that's quite a thing to say, because they've had nuclear and fossil fuels as part of their mix for many decades. So to actually, for their top utility to come out and say that Spain, the future is renewables, it's quite an admission.
Okay, so you covered a lot of ground there. Kind of circle back around. Just from my standpoint, and for the U.S. listeners at least, help us kind of understand what role the EU plays in all this, because you talk about, well, they're leading in investment, but they're not necessarily following through on some of their actions, and you got Poland, who's taking a lot of flack for it because they're not necessarily putting the money in like Germany is, and you got all these these different nations, but they're under the banner of the EU. So just from our standpoint, how does that work itself out practically? Does the EU oversee and can enforce regulation over these different nations, or is these type of policies left up to the individual nations?
Yeah, that's the hub of the problem. Some countries are more committed than others. There's a general target. I think it's about 30% of the entire EU bloc to be renewable by 2020 and 27% energy efficiency. But it's left up to the individual member states to find out how they get there. So, some countries are dragging their feet, and I mean, as long as the entire bloc meets its targets, that's what that'll satisfy Brussels. So part of the problem is the transmission links, or the interconnectivity between the grids aren't currently as modernized or as developed as they could be. So they're starting to get there, but it may be 2030 before you see real progress, because in certain, say, geographies, renewables are really easy. Say for the likes of the Republic of Ireland or Britain, they have a massive offshore wind power capability, whereas for Central European countries, that's not really as strong. So what they're trying to do now is develop the links between each countries to transmit power from the sunnier side to the north during times of, I suppose, when solar is strong, and then I suppose Germany is an example of that in microcosm, because they're having to spend billions now in transmitting the wind power they have in the north of the country down to the main industrial hubs in the south, and there's a lot of pressure on them, because they assumed they could do this on overhead transmission lines, but actually there was so much objections by the public that it's now having to go underground, and that's adding to the expense of that. So just get back to your question. Yeah, I mean, the fact that they've left it, that it isn't legally an in-member state obligation, that it's kind of, they give you guidelines in terms of what they expect your country to achieve, but how you go about that is your own way, and some countries are moving faster than others. And at the same time, if the overall target is achieved, then a lot of that foot dragging will be forgiven.
With the Paris Climate Agreement, the U.S. pulling out here back in June, there was a lot of coverage. It felt like the Europeans were kind of wagging their finger at us, like, "Hey, you guys need to get it together." But what I'm hearing you say is that maybe what's coming out from the top level officials is a little bit contradictory than what we're getting told in the media. How is the sentiment in a country like Germany? Let's just use them for example. When you look at it and you go, okay, we're going to roll back coal, we're going to roll back nuclear. We don't really have a way to replace that, guys. But guess what? Trust us, it'll be there. What's the sentiment amongst the average day Joe just walking the streets? Is he comfortable that the government can get the power replaced by 2040, or is there kind of a little bit of maybe a nervousness amongst Germans that are saying like, I'm not really sure that this is the best way to go about this?
Yeah, Germany is an unusual case because they have some of the highest electricity prices in Europe. Yet, when the main election, there was an analysis done this week of what Germans are feeling about the forthcoming election, and it's way down the list of concerns. They're more interested in like economic migrants and refugees and that sort of societal issue than they are about energy. Yet they're expected to, a large proportion of their bill has been, over the last 10 years has come down to this kind of facilitation of renewables. There is a hard core of people in Germany who believe that it's, it's a bad idea what they're doing. But I think if you look at it is what it is now. I mean, two of the top utilities in Germany would also be the top European utilities, RWE and E.ON, and because this is so government-driven, those companies have lost billions over the last decade, like especially the last 5 to 6 years, so much so that they have had to split their companies into what you could largely see as fossil fuel-based and then renewables and energy services divisions. And it just looks like there's no going back now, and they've decided that I suppose that there's a lot of money to be made in clean energy, and I think maybe that's the same in the US. Is that Trump maybe he realizes there's a lot of money that can be made, that there's a lot of innovation going on, and possibly it's not so clear cut that it's a waste of taxpayers' money.
Yeah, I guess my stance has been on the if you just take solar for instance, is that it seems like, especially some of these projects we see here in the States, they're kind of, because they are government backed, and from a consumer standpoint, you need tax credits to kind of balance out whether or not it's worth you to put them on your house or not. I'm curious if we were to kind of roll back some of the tax credits, if it would change the way entrepreneurs and investors looked at building out solar panels and projects, and how he just thought about solar in general. Because right now it seems to be, and I'm no expert on this, but it just seems to be that the industry on some level goes, okay, well, you know what, we're going to get X amount of dollars from our government, and then the consumer is going to get X amount of tax credits, and so we're trying to hit a margin that works right there. And that would seem to indicate that you're going to think about how to design your product in a certain way. Whereas if you didn't have those government tax credits on either side, you would try to figure out what the market would want, and that would probably shape your whole business model. What is your take on that?
Well, a really good place to be today was the Bloomberg Energy Summit because, we had one speaker from GE, actually, General Electric, the digital division, and his name was, let me try and think, Stephen Martin. Well, same name as the comedian, so yeah. Quite a memorable name, really. But he said that this, what he was trying to get across was the sheer extent of work that had to be done for the power industry to come to terms with this new paradigm, and how, I suppose, there was going to be no real market design that was perfect. I suppose, if I could try and get it, I'll come back to him later because he had some really interesting things to say. But what you're seeing here is this, it's a revolution, really. I mean, I only got into this industry about 5 years ago, and there was talk of a utility debt spiral then, but little did I know that it actually was just taking place at such a rapid state that it has, where you have a company like RWE, who is now split into two companies, Energy being one of them, who are, a very traditional, RWE were a very traditional generator, central generator, who never had to think much about so much that they have to think about now. So what they're doing now is they're actually going into things like crowdfunding in order to raise funding for projects that they're partnering with startups in order to innovate into the new energy. So they're having to think in a completely different way. I think the traditional way of doing things, you're still going to need that central equipment. You're still going to need those central assets, or that asset base. But what you have to kind of countenance is all this digital technology and decentralized technology and distributed power. It's also coming into the reckoning that also has to be sort of in this matrix, and it's just such a massive thing for utilities to get their heads around. That it generally every day it's evolving. I mean, the guy from GE, what he said was, today is actually the easiest day we'll ever have, and that was his way of saying that for the next 10 years, it's just not going to get any easier day by day. It's just such a huge transformation.
Right, and one of the things we said on the show is, in our opinion, or at least my opinion is that if you look globally, you just step back and you look globally, what's going on here? You talked about decentralization, and you look at what's going on in Africa, and you look at what's going, where you have a lot of emerging markets, and then you look at a place like Europe or the U.S. or Canada, where you have a lot of first world markets, right? And you kind of look at how we design the market, how we design the grid here, rather, compared to what's going on in these emerging markets. And what you're seeing, in my opinion, is 10, 15, maybe 20 years down the road is when those emerging markets become quote unquote first world, or closer to first world as far as technology and ability to reach out to the rest of the world. I think how they position themselves in the grid will look a lot different than we've done in the U.S. or in Europe. And I think if we were to step back and watch how that trend happens, we might figure out there's better ways to manage our grids here in the U.S. or Europe, just because as you mentioned, we've built this system under older technology. And so the new technology is coming along, and how to incorporate that, I think, is a question that's probably not being asked enough, at least, especially by government entities.
Yeah, I mean, developing countries are like, I suppose you get a lot of companies. I mean, I know Caterpillar are doing a lot in say, sub-Saharan Africa as well, and Asia too, in terms of, there's a lot of parallels with the telecoms world where, a lot of these countries, they didn't have a proper grid like we were used to in Europe or the US and Australia and various other places, but they haven't had to. The mobile phone has meant that they don't need it. They don't need the infrastructure that we needed. The mobile phone has meant they could leap. They could make the leap without using all that sort of investment that we had to do over a century. And there's a lot of parallels with the power infrastructure now, in that distributed energy from microgrids being connected up all over the place. Solar photovoltaics, on-site wind. Caterpillar have some neat technology with, I suppose, they would have diesel gensets with solar power and storage together. And there's a lot more of that going on, and it's they're capable of having little off-grid communities. And I suppose some people believe, there's going to be a huge super grid someday where all that sort of digitalization will come in and distributed energy will come together and make what we were used to over the last century obsolete in many ways. That it's going to be about microgrids connecting worldwide, not geographically at first and then worldwide, where there will be a new form of grid security or energy security that we wouldn't have envisaged before. We would have relied on baseload power from coal or gas or nuclear, but nowadays, renewables and digitalization are, a lot of people would be cynical about how far ahead we have to get before that transformation can be fully complete. And that's another worry, in that, what you have there in Britain, where a lot of coal power and nuclear power has been shut down because it's too old, and yet they haven't provided that backup generation yet. That renewables is intermittent, nuclear There's a nuclear power plant being built in the southwest of England, for example, that is 10 years behind schedule in terms of when it was supposed to open, and yet coal and nuclear has been phased down. So you're having a situation where distributed energy is coming more under the microscope, and governments are trying to make sure energy efficient practices become more the norm, and we reduce the amount of demand on the grid, and at the same time, district energy schemes are coming more in vogue. Again, it's in flux to such an extent that people wouldn't have recognized the energy infrastructure conversations we're having now compared to a decade ago.
Oh, I know it, absolutely. Well, look, I know you are extremely busy and you've had a long day. You're on the other side of the pond, so it's probably late there. I appreciate your time. You are, of course, the international digital editor at Power Engineering International, and the editor of Decentralized Energy. Go ahead and promote websites, links, conferences, events, anything you need to, so the listeners can go and check out your work.
Yeah, I suppose decentralized energy would be my main concern. And the editor of that website, we have a LinkedIn group, Twitter, Facebook, blogs. We have got a lot of feature articles from the US in particular of people who are in recent times doing a lot of like demand side generation, and also, as you know, with all the superstorms, there's a lot of, I suppose, off-grid companies who are coming more into vogue now. There's a lot more, I suppose, respect for those companies, even the smallest ones, who are helping businesses stay online when there's a lot of problems with storms and even cyber terrorism. Power Engineering International then is another one under the Penwell umbrella, and we cover nuclear, coal, gas, renewables, decentralized energy, and grid subjects. We've got a new show coming up in June next year in Austria, in Vienna, and I would urge a lot of your listeners to attend if they can, because it's the inaugural Electrify Europe show. So if your listeners are really interested in finding out this confluence of decentralized energy, distributed power, digitization, and how that's interacting with traditional European utilities, that's going to be a good one to attend. We were formerly known as PowerGen Europe. You'll probably be familiar with PowerGen International, this year coming from Las Vegas. I'll be attending that if anyone wants to catch up with me. We have PowerGen Asia, PowerGen India and Central Asia, PowerGen Africa, and lots of different, I suppose, shows that you can get to know geographically what's important to each region.
Right. And we will link to as much of that as we can. There's a lot there, but we'll link to the main stuff for sure, and the upcoming conferences as well. And look, even if you're not interested in this topic, I'm trying to figure out if I can go just to get to Vienna. So it's a good excuse to get over there, isn't it? Say, well, I got a conference I got to attend, and get to spend a few days in Austria. That sounds like it's worth the price of admission, if nothing else. Well, we will link to this in the show notes and let the listeners find it out. And I will see if I'm going to be at the one in Vegas. I'm not sure if I'll be there or not. If so, I will shoot you an email and we can connect offline. Well, it was great to have you on today. And look, let's do it again here in a few months and kind of talk about some more stuff. We could talk about this all day, as you know, there's so many things we could go over. So I really appreciate your time today, and we look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and good day to you.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.